Please open to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. We want to read here verses 32 to 34. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Of course, here the New Testament gives us a chapter full of what we sometimes designate as heroes of faith. Men and women of old who were committed to God, who lived for Him, who loved Him, who served Him. And among those mentioned here are those who quenched the violence of fire. I imagine our mind goes to one place in the Old Testament when we think about that, and we think about these men that are referenced here as an example of what people of faith faced in ancient times. It's one of those accounts where we see what it is that they went through because of their commitment to the Lord. It's a reminder to us that serving God in this world comes with a certain amount of danger. The world has not changed. We may live in what we consider to be more civilized times, but we are on a razor's edge between what is civil and what is uncivil, between what is humane and what is inhumane. Because the devil is still at work among men, and men still have the same nature that is susceptible to following the will of the dark one, if you will. When we read about these who quench the violence of fires and other heroes of faith, we're encouraged as we think about that regarding God's power and God's care in our lives. The men of the quote or the reference there in Hebrews 11 verse 34 are the focus of the chapter in Daniel, where it gives us a record of that event in Daniel chapter 3. They are at center stage, if you will, in the Bible story as it unfolds here. We remember that during this time, as the book of Daniel is being written, it's the time of the Babylonian captivity, that these Jews have been taken away around 605, particularly with Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, as well as Daniel, that they were taken away in that first wave of captivity. And they were pressed into the service of the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. They were trained up for those 3 years, as we previously studied in Daniel chapter 1. And from the very beginning, they displayed a faith in God in trying and challenging circumstances. And what we read about in Daniel chapter 3 just further shows how devoted they truly were to the Lord and what they were willing to endure on His behalf. So we want to study Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 1 here. Daniel 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So we're introduced here, first of all, to the king making this great gold image. It says it was 60 cubits by 6, so 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide. Of course, in our terminology, the measurements we use, that's the idea of 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. So try to imagine, if you will, a 9-story building. So 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. Now, it may be, sometimes we think, well, that's peculiarly thin and tall. But very often what they would do is they would build a massive base on which they would place it. And so the overall height was 90 feet, not that the image itself necessarily was 90 feet altogether, but it was 90 feet high and the image was 9 feet wide. And it was likely overlaid with gold versus being made with pure gold. That would be incredibly hard for them to handle because of the weight. So you think about that large statue, and some people have some skepticism. Well, how does ancient man make all these things? How do they make it of gold and all of that? Well, if you remember, something that's well documented in secular history is the Colossus of Rhodes. It was built about 300 years after this, and it was 105 feet tall. So it's not as though ancient man didn't have the skills, the abilities, the know-how, the engineering abilities to be able to make something like this. And so Nebuchadnezzar made this, and he covered that image in gold. And it says that the image was set up on the plain of Dura. Now, depending on the sources that you look at, there are some various ideas about where this plain existed, but all of them are essentially in agreement that it's, of course, outside the city of Babylon proper, about 6 to 12 miles, somewhere that's not too far, but it's not there in the city, set up outside, and a place that was suitable for this statue to be built and set up that the people could gather and to worship. And it mentions that all these people are gathered there on the dedication of this statue. And that means they traveled outside of Babylon, anybody who was there, or the other provinces of the empire. They would have traveled in and gone out to this site. Now, that may tell us a little bit about why Daniel's not mentioned here. Because people wonder, well, why isn't Daniel mentioned along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Did Daniel worship that image? Well, you read the book of Daniel, and the absolute answer is no. He did not worship this image. It could be that as the king and all these other officials left out of Babylon, the city proper, Daniel was left there in charge, and so he's not around these events, not subject to them. Could be many other reasons. Could be he's on a trip, going away somewhere. It could be that he didn't bow down, but these Chaldean officials were afraid to challenge Daniel in his powerful position, and so they reported his lesser subordinates, if you will, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But however it is, we do not want to accuse Daniel of having compromised his faith in what is unfolding here. So it tells us then, the remainder of chapter 3, that all these officials are summoned. And after they are summoned and brought out here to where this image is, the decree is given that they are to bow and to worship this image. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have traveled out there before that command is heralded out by the herald that they are to bow and to worship. Well, all the people, it says in verse 7, when that music was played, bowed and worshiped. The peoples, the nations, the languages, they fell down and worshiped that gold image. The question is, why was all this done? Because this is an incredible expense. This is logistically a massive undertaking, not just to build that great image, but for all these officials, their attendants, and everybody to travel out there. Why would the king do this? And it could be it's related to Daniel chapter 2, where he had the dream of that great image. Remember that great image that we studied last week, the head of gold, then you have the chest of silver, then you have the belly of bronze, and then you have the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay. And as Daniel interpreted that for him, he told him, "You, O king, are that head of gold." So that head of gold is representative not just really of Nebuchadnezzar, but of his empire and the Babylonian empire and its glory. And it very well could be that the king is trying to declare, my empire will not end because this entire image is of gold, not gold, silver, bronze, and iron. He didn't make a duplication of that image, but he made the entire thing of gold. That could be telling in his mindset, no, my kingdom is not going to end. And I'm going to make a declaration of that to all peoples. And I'm going to unify everyone, the peoples, the nations, the languages. This would be a political unity in a sense, and also a religious unity as well. And it's not as though he's introducing a new God for them to worship. It's likely that he said this represents another God. Maybe he's thinking even of himself, but one of the gods that they normally would have worshiped. But he says, here's the image, you all come together in worship. So he's trying to pull his people together and make a statement about him, about his kingdom, his rule, and the empire. Let's go down to verse 8 now. It says, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were reported to the king, it says, by these Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldeans that we read about before were those who were the leaders among the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, and things like that. These Chaldeans may be that same group of individuals, or it could just simply be the idea that these are the natives of Babylon who are leaders among the people, and they are angry and jealous and envious of the Jews that have been brought here as captives and are now in very high and important positions because they, remember, had been promoted not too long before. And so they're not happy about that. And we see that really as a theme through the book of Daniel, the idea that these native people don't like the Jews being in important, influential positions. Now, when it says they came and accused him, some translations have maliciously accused him. And that comes from the idea that the original meaning of the word, the literal interpretation of that word is eat the morsels of. The accused, eat the morsels. What does that sound like to you? Sounds like they're biting, chewing. It's the idea of slandering. So they're biting away at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it's kind of interesting to me that when they go to the king, they repeat his decree to him to emphasize the fact, this is what you said, now we want you to do it to these men. So they're trying to make the case that these Jews are in rebellion against you, O king, saying they have not regarded you, O king. It's an insult to you what they have done. They're defiant toward you. So in a sense, they're trying to make it personal with Nebuchadnezzar. And when it says there that there are certain Jews, that's a derogatory way of referencing these men because they looked down upon the Jews. They stood out because of their faith, and they were disliked because they were different in believing in Jehovah God, the one true God. Well, verse 13 then, we see Nebuchadnezzar's reaction. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." So Nebuchadnezzar threatens these young Hebrew men. He's in a rage and a fury. And by the way, that indicates to you that back in chapter 2, when the man went in and vouched for Daniel to give an interpretation of the dream, when the king had declared all of them are to be put to death, he was risking his life. Because this king is not a temperate man. He's not a patient man. He's not a compassionate, understanding man. He is enraged over the fact that there are 3 young men in his kingdom who did not respect the command that he gave to bow to that image, and he's an extremely arrogant individual. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are brought in before him in this enraged state, and it seems he tempers himself just a bit because he asks him, "Is it true?" At least he's fair enough to ask, "Is this really what happened? You really defied me? Did you do that?" But he quickly dismisses that, and he says, "If you do it the next time, then we'll be okay. Next time the music plays, you bow down, you worship that image, I'll let this go." Because evidently he saw there was a value in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He knew there was value in Daniel, and evidently he sees these young men have served me well in my kingdom. So he doesn't want to act rashly. He doesn't want to just get rid of them right now. So he says, "Look, is it true? Okay, even if it is true, I'll spare you if you just bow down next time." So given, if you will, a second chance. And if you don't do that, know for sure I'm going to throw you into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? I have power, and no one's going to interfere with that power. No God can stop me from doing what I want to do. So he really has elevated himself to the level of a deity, a God. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego then, in verse 16, essentially say to him, "We don't have to discuss this. We don't need to deliberate on it. Jehovah is able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, then we would rather go and burn in that fire than to compromise our faith." Let's notice now, verses 19 to 25, of course, what happens when they make that declaration. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that the heat of the furnace They heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God." The king, of course, is furious. They're standing there defying him as he's giving them a second chance. He thinks he's extending some mercy to them, and they are absolutely entrenched and will not budge. And so he's furious about that and has that furnace heated to 7 times more than it's usually heated. Now, that very well may be hyperbole and a figurative description, simply to say he had it heated up as much as it could possibly be heated up. Now, Babylonian furnaces were, I should say, shaped like what we think of an old-fashioned milk jug, kind of narrow at the top and then a bigger belly at the bottom. And they're open at the top. And in the bottom, there is an opening there where they could take the things in to burn. And then, of course, they're going to smelt the gold, the silver, the iron, whatever it is that they're trying to make. And it may be that this was the one that they used to build this statue, and so it would be a fairly big one to get the job done. But be that as it may, one of these furnaces, at least the references tell us, could be heated to 1,800 degrees or were heated to 1,800 degrees to do the smelting and things like that. That was not uncommon. And so he's saying heated up more than that. Now, one of the things I looked up, I'm sorry if you think this is morbid, but I looked up cremation. And cremation, for that, depending on the source you look at, 1,600 to 2,000 degrees, 1,400 to 1,800 degrees, and I think different states have different laws and maybe different machines, but basically, you could cremate a person in this. That's what they're being thrown into. Now, when you think about that, you have these mighty men of valor. In other words, these are very strong men. They're going to get a hold of and manhandle Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and force them to do these things. And one of the things that they force on them is they have the coats, the trousers, the turbans, and their other garments. Now, why would they fully deck them out and all these things to throw them in there? Well, the reason is because all that's going to catch fire and they're going to burn all that much more when they get into it. And it says they're thrown into the furnace and they fall down. It's not as though they're just pushed into that furnace and somehow they find a little bit cooler spot and they run around it and they bolt back out. It makes the point to say, look, they're covered in flammable material, and when they're shoved in there, they fall down, which means they most definitely, under normal circumstances, would have caught fire, would have been burned to death. And it goes on to point out that those mighty men of valor who took them up to shove them in there died because the flame was so intense. So it's not as though this is a happenstance, this is kind of a freak incident that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't burn alive in there. No, they were thrown in, they fell over, they're bound, and they're covered in flammable material. But then the king looks in there because that opening's at ground level. He can see right in there. He looks in and he sees people walking around. So they fell down and now they're upright and they're not bound. They're still clothed and they're walking around. And he confirms that with his officials. Didn't we throw 3 men into that fire? Well, yes. Well, I see 4 in there. The fourth is like the Son of God. And there are people who've speculated, well, is that the Christ? Well, that's not what it's pointing to. If anything, this is an angel of God who's in there, who he would look at and think son of the gods, as some translations have. He saw this spiritual being in there, as angels would come and help the servants of God from time to time. You have an angel here coming, just like in Daniel chapter 6, an angel comes and shuts the mouths of the lions. Here's an angel that is in that fire that Nebuchadnezzar looks at and is amazed to see him in there and to see the others in there, and they're just walking around. Well, then we notice this in verses 26 and following. Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together. And they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language who speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So he calls these young men out of that furnace. And everybody gathers around, which would be natural. How in the world did they survive that? And they want to get a close look. And they go up and they're looking at them and they realize the fires had no effect whatsoever, not even that their hair has been singed. I don't know if you've ever been burning in a bonfire, or for me personally, I have lit a grill before and singed my hair all the way up my arm. Just poof. You know, how does that happen? How do you go into the midst of this thousands of degrees fire and your hair's not even singed? Because it's easy to singe hair. Well, it's not done. It didn't happen to them. And perhaps what is even more amazing than that, you can't even smell fire on them. I mean, I can go out sometimes outside and the fire not even be near me and come in and smell like smoke. Anybody who's been around a campfire, a bonfire, you can come in smelling like smoke. So how could that happen? Well, the only way that could happen is it's a miracle. God completely protected and shielded them. So the people are standing there amazed. The king is amazed at that. And so the king makes this declaration about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not that he's converted and become a monotheist and he believes in Jehovah God and is ready to give up all the paganism. He's just simply saying their God is the great God. If he can do this, if he can deliver them out of that fire. And so no one, he says, is allowed to speak anything amiss. You can't say anything negative. Not that everyone has to worship the one true God. He's just simply saying, you can't speak against him. And if you do, you're going to die, and your house is going to be in shambles. It's going to be an ash heap. So there'll be severe consequences. But something else that he notes in there is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had great faith, saying that his servants who trusted in him were delivered by him. They had this faith that allowed them to be delivered. And so when it's all said and done, not only are they not executed in shame and humiliation, if you will, but they're promoted in the kingdom. Let's think about a couple of things regarding this account. First of all, if you would notice 2 Peter chapter 1, keep your place there in Daniel 3, 2 Peter chapter 1, and I want us to think about the value of godly friends. In 2 Peter 1, verse 1, Peter writes this, Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who have obtained like precious faith with us by the righteousness of our God and Savior Jesus Christ. You know, there are others who share the faith, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They all shared the same faith, the same convictions. They had the same outlook and worldview, if you will. If you go back to that chapter, it's interesting how many times when it mentions them, it mentions all three of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even the enemies were talking about, hey, you've got these Jews here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then it says Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there talking to the king. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fire. And they're promoted. It's saying that these guys are a unit together. They're close to each other. They shared the faith together, and it brought them together in this foreign land, in this pagan culture. We understand that when we have friends of the faith, they provide great support to us. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13, it gives us this exhortation, which is, exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. One of the blessings of having godly peers is the fact that they will exhort you. They will support you. They will help you. You think about having a companionship with someone who is of the same religious convictions and practices the same religious beliefs as you do. You know, when you're like-minded, when you're around that person, you can be yourself. You don't have to be on the edge. You don't have to be on guard. You don't have to worry about how they view you, what they think about you, what they're going to say to you, ridicule, insult, mock you, whatever it may be. Now, when you have a companion, you're around people who share the faith, you can be somewhat at ease with them. And you can talk about things that you share in common and not worry about what the topic of conversation is going to be or the things that they might say. You can do things together that you enjoy with one another. That's a great blessing to have friends of the faith. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 26, another aspect of having these friends and getting closer to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the way that they were with each other, it says in Proverbs 12 verse 26, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. So be careful about your friends. Be careful about those influences. Paul writes about that, 1 Corinthians 15:33. How the evil company corrupts good morals. The proverb writer here is saying, be careful about choosing your friends. And the righteous is going to be careful about that. You want people who are going to help you in serving God instead of being a stumbling block. And you can provide encouragement to them and they to you. That you would all stay on that path of the straight and narrow, if you will. As opposed to, as the proverb writer says, the wicked lead them astray. You want people who are going to help you walk the walk. And then you think about this, Proverbs 18 and verse 24. Proverbs 18, verse 24. It says, a man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Who is that friend that sticks closer than a brother? It's the friend with whom you've walked through the fire. That's the friend that sticks closer than a brother. Men, if you read about men who've been in combat together, they have a bond unlike any other bond. They're close. And there's a sweetness to that kind of relationship. Husbands and wives form that kind of bond because they go through the trials of life together. And so there's a closeness and a sweetness to that. And when we have friends of like precious faith, and we go through the trials of the kingdom together. We go through those fires. We face those challenges and those battles together. We go through hardships and we're there with each other going through them. We're bound that much closer to one another. And we know they're reliable. I can count on them because we've been through these things together. So we need to have friends who are of like precious faith, godly friends. But then again, I want us to think about this phrase in Daniel 3, verse 28, that the king used. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 28, where Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that their bodies belonged to God. Now you back up to chapter 1. And Daniel, along with these men, refused to eat the king's delicacies. They refused to defile themselves. What does that have to do with? It has to do with their bodies. They weren't going to defile their body with something that was contrary to the law of Moses. And here it says, now they yielded their bodies. So in their life, they recognize, my body doesn't belong to me. My body belongs to God. And whether it's keeping pollution out or offering it up as a sacrifice, I'll do whatever the Lord requires me to do. And so we need to have that same mentality, that same understanding. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 20, the Apostle Paul says here, "For you were bought at a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." Our soul belongs to God, and we all understand that. We need to be equally convicted that our body belongs to God. He purchased it with a price truly of the blood of the Son of God. It's not ours to do with as we please. In Galatians chapter 5, we recall how the Apostle Paul in verses 19 to 21 gives the works of the flesh here. Galatians 5, verse 19, "Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God." So these various works of the flesh, the idea of your body being involved in this, and it could be the mind as well, the envy and the selfish ambition and jealousies, things like that. But the adulteries, the fornications, uncleanness, lewdness, all those things dealing with sexual sins, which is, by the way, in the context of what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, when he talks about how your bodies are not to be joined to a harlot. Don't defile, don't pollute your body with these worldly, fleshly things. Why? Because our body belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. Don't pollute yourself. And willingly be ready to give yourself as a sacrifice to the Lord. The Apostle Paul understood this, and the Apostle Paul was willing over in 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4, and beginning in verse 6 there. "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Remember, the Apostle Paul is facing execution here. He knows it's coming. And he says, I am being poured out as a drink offering. And one of the things about a drink offering, it was completely poured out. He's saying, I'm ready to be completely poured out. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before the king, and they said, you know what? God's able to deliver us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to worship. We're ready and willing to give ourselves, give our bodies in devotion and commitment to him. We're willing to suffer that. And the king specifically acknowledged they yielded their bodies. Paul says, I'm ready to yield my body. Back in chapter 1 and verse 12, 2 Timothy 1 verse 12, he had made this statement. For this reason I also suffered these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day. You know, we can confidently sacrifice ourselves, yield our bodies to whatever men want to do to our bodies, because we know that God will hold us in his hand, so to speak. Even if our bodies are given over, as Paul knows his is going to be, that's okay. Because what I've committed to him, my soul, he's going to keep. My body, my soul belong to him. I devote them to him, and he will preserve me. In the resurrection, I'll be given a new body, an eternal body, to dwell with him in heaven. So I gladly, willingly yield my body here and now. Another lesson that we see back in Daniel chapter 3 is the idea or the concept of loyalty in both the small and the great, the little things and the big things, if you will. So let's go to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13 as we think about this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to eat an unholy diet. What's the big deal about eating the king's food? Eating certain types of meat? What's the big deal in that? That's a little thing, right? It's just food, it's just sustenance, and it provides nutrients. What's really the big deal? But you know, that image, that's idolatry. That is a big deal. So could you see someone in their situation rationalizing, I'll never bow to an idol. You know, I'll have some ham. Not a big deal. Well, I'm going to be sure I've got this one down because it's a big deal. To worship a golden image? What I have for lunch? Is that a big deal? Well, think about that. The two really are connected, are they not? Because both of them are governed by God's law. So in Matthew chapter 13, Matthew 13, beginning in verse 10, the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? He answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, what he has will be taken away from him. So the Lord is essentially saying those little things, that little faith you have, if you will lead to bigger things. In the parable of the talents of money, one of the things he says, you've been faithful over a little, I'll make you ruler over many. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were faithful in what was little, and then they were challenged in what was big. And we use those words accommodatively. So we need to be faithful in all things. Faithful in what's considered little, and be faithful in considering the things that are big. Oh, I will never denounce Jesus as the Christ, but do you take his name in vain? Well, I'll never deny that the Bible is God's word, but do you sometimes skip church services because you just don't feel like going? Well, the Bible's true, but church, you can take a back seat. I'll never believe in evolution. Never going to believe in that because it's ridiculous. But I think there are Christians in all churches. Is it really that big a deal to think that? There's people saved in the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, the Presbyterian, the Catholic Church. I think there's saved people everywhere. Well, I'll never deny that there's a creator, but compromise on the one true church and what the Bible teaches about the plan of salvation. Loyalty in the small things matters. And when we are faithful and true to the Lord in those things, he will open doors of opportunity for us to show our faithfulness and to serve him in those greater things. If you will, open to number 837. 837. The young men that we've looked at today, they lived over 2,500 years ago, and yet they are such a strong and powerful example for us today. They lived lives of conviction. They were willing to pay the ultimate price, and they knew that their master was in heaven and not on earth. Our lives can be ones of dedication and service as well. We may surround ourselves with godly friends and ought to surround ourselves with godly friends because there's very little we can do about the culture we live in. Yes, we can influence people maybe one by one, but we need those who are close to us that serve God. We can use our physical strength to advance the cause of Christ, whatever powers, whatever abilities, whatever skills that we have, use our bodies in serving him. And we can be steadfast in our faith and ready to face greater and greater challenges for our master. So the question is, how is your faith today? Do you have a deep and strong and abiding commitment in the small and the great? Are you ready and willing to yield yourself to the Lord, that you will not pollute yourself with the things of the flesh, and you will sacrifice for the cause? If you recognize as a child of God that you've compromised in that commitment to the Lord, then won't you repent? Seek the Lord's mercy and forgiveness. If there's something you need to confess this morning before this audience, do that. We'll pray with you. We'll pray for you. Draw on the strength, the power, the blessing, and having those of like precious faith here for you to encourage you, to pray on your behalf. If you're not a child of God and you recognize, I need to commit myself to the Lord, the sin in which you have been engaged in your life is tearing your soul apart. You realize I'm in danger every hour. Then won't you turn to him, yield yourself to the will of God, surrender your heart, your mind, your body, your soul to him, to serve him believing Jesus is the Christ, confessing that freely here today, turning away from your sin and being baptized to have your sins washed away. Do that. Be committed to him. And you can be a great example of faith and an encouragement to all of us. So if you need to respond, please come forward while we stand and sing.